In this video, I described the price consumption curve. The question that we aim to answer is how the consumption choice of a household or of an individual, so a consumer in general, changes when the price of one of the goods changes. We have already discussed the effects of a one-off price change and its effect on consumption in the videos on utility maximization, but now we do this more systematically and derive the price consumption curve that shows the reaction of consumption to a wider range of price changes. This will then also allow us to make the connection between the price consumption curve and the demand function. On this slide, we see the graphical depiction of the utility maximizing choice of households when they decide upon the consumption levels of goods 1 and 2. We have that the black line is the budget constraint. To the left are all the possible combinations of the two goods that are feasible with the budget of the consumer and the given prices, while on the right we have all the goods that are not feasible, all the consumption bundles that are not feasible given the prices. The slope of the budget line is again, as before, the negative price ratio, and it shows how much of the good 2 in this case I have to forego when I want to consume more of good 1. The red line, that's the indifference curve. It reflects the preferences of the consumers for the two goods, as we know it again from the corresponding videos. And we also know from the utility maximization chapters that the optimal consumption choice would be point A in this case, where the budget line is tangent to the indifference curve. So that's the optimal consumption point. At this point, the negative price ratio is equal to the marginal rate of substitution between the two goods from the consumer's perspective. So how willing the consumer is to shift the two goods according to the preferences, and how much the market is willing to exchange the two goods given the price system. So if these two are the same, then the consumer is maximizing utility. If you need to refresh these concepts, then you can do so by going back to the videos on consumer choice, particularly on utility maximization and the explanation of what the marginal rate of substitution is and why it is equal to the price ratio in the case of utility maximization. If we want to construct the price consumption curve, then we need to analyze what happens if we have a price change for one of the goods here. In this case, we have a change in the price of good 1. Good 1 becomes cheaper, so the consumer can afford more from it, all else being equal. Now this implies that the budget line shifts counterclockwise, or rotates counterclockwise basically, around the point at which the budget line intersects with the vertical curve. The reason is that the price of good 2 doesn't change, and therefore if we spend all the budget on good 2, we can still afford the same level as before. But if we spend some part of the budget on good 1, then we can afford more of it. And if we spend all the budget on good 1, we could afford now this level instead of that level that we had here. So overall, after this change, the budget line is flatter and the set of feasible consumption bundles is greater. Now what will the consumer do in this case? Well, here the optimal point would then be the consumption choice at point B. The consumer buys more of good 1, which is intuitive because good 1 has become cheaper, and it buys less of good 2, which is also intuitive. Good 1 has become cheaper, so if the two goods are substitutes, then households would buy more of good 1 and less of good 2. Now the reaction of good 1 in this case here is unambiguous, so the consumer will spend more on it, but the reaction of good 2 is not unambiguous, because in this case it depends on whether the substitution effect, that the other good became cheaper, dominates the income effect. The income effect is that the household can afford to buy more of both goods because the price decrease made the budget set larger. So the household can afford to consume more of both goods. So in terms of good 2, the household on the one hand can consume more, that's the income effect. On the other hand, it may want to consume more of good 1 and sacrifice some consumption of good 2 because of the substitution effect. And now from this move, from point A to point B, the substitution effect dominates. But as we will see next, it could also be that the income effect dominates. Now we have a further decrease in the price of good 1. We see the budget line becomes flatter still, and the new optimal consumption point is point C, where again the budget line is attentioned to the indifference curve. Now we observe that the consumer consumes more of good 1, but now it does not consume less of good 2, instead it consumes more of good 2. So in this case the income effect dominates the substitution effect. Now we can draw many more of these curves for different prices of good 1 and connect the optimal consumption choices, and that is what will provide us with the price consumption curve. And this is depicted now on this slide here. So we have a connection of the optimal consumption points in the different cases. So we had point A for the first price that we considered of good 1, point B for the second price, point C for the third price. And if we connect these points, we get the price consumption curve. We observe that this curve is downward sloping first when the substitution effect dominates for a good 2, and then it becomes upward sloping when the income effect dominates. And this curve now provides us with combinations between the consumption choices of the two goods and the price changes that we have. What we observe in general is that from the perspective of good 2, between the points A and B, the two goods are substitutes, which means that if the substitute good becomes cheaper, I would consume less of good 2. But between points B and C, the two goods become complements. So if I consume more of good 1, I would also want to consume more of good 2. We will come back to income and substitution effects in later lecture casts, where we will go into more into the details here. Now finally, we can make a connection between the price consumption curve that we have here in the upper diagram and the demand function that we have in the lower diagram. The demand function for good 1 is downward sloping in this diagram, where we have the consumption level on the horizontal axis and the price on the vertical axis, which means that if the price is higher, we would consume less, and if the price is lower, we would consume more. You know this already from the lecture casts on the demand function. What we see here is that we can use the price consumption curve to construct this demand function, because here we have the price of good 1. So in this case, it is high, and the consumption level of good 1 is comparatively low. Now if the price decreases and we move to point B, we consume more of the good and the price is lower. And if the price decreases further, we come to point C, where the price is even lower and consumption is even higher. So we see that each of the points on the price consumption curve corresponds to one of the points on the demand function, and that also means that every point on the demand function is one of the utility maximization outcomes for the household for the different price levels. So to summarize, price consumption curves show the consumption bundle choices for different price levels, and they can be used to construct the different demand curves. For normal goods, a falling price leads to more consumption. And along the demand curve, utility is maximized in every point for the given price ratio. And this also means that the price ratio on each of these points is equal to the marginal rate of substitution, where you can go again back to the corresponding videos if you need a refresher on that.